The mortar shell screamed through the Afghan dawn at 0547 hours, its whistle cutting through the mountain air like death itself. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez hit the dirt as shrapnel tore through the forward operating base, her medical kit, scattering across the rocky ground. She had exactly 4 minutes before the Taliban fighters reached the perimeter, and 3 of her wounded soldiers were trapped in the collapsed bunker behind enemy lines. The same soldiers who had laughed when she'd been denied combat deployment for being physically inadequate for frontline duties. For 18 months, Maria had been the perfect support medic, stationed safely behind the lines, patching up minor injuries, managing medical supplies, and enduring the constant reminder that she wasn't strong enough for real combat. At 5'4" and 125 pounds, she'd been relegated to the soft assignments while her male counterparts earned their combat infantry badges in the mountains of Helmand Province. But being underestimated had taught Maria something valuable about survival. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone ignores. The attack had begun at dawn, just as Maria was completing her morning inventory of medical supplies in the base clinic. Forward operating base sentinel sat perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Kunar Valley, a strategic position that controlled the main supply route between Pakistan and the Afghan interior. The base housed 200 soldiers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, including Maria's medical unit and 3 rifle companies that had been conducting counterinsurgency operations for the past 6 months. Maria had been awake since 400, reviewing casualty reports and preparing medical equipment for the day's patrol missions. Her routine was methodical, precise, and had earned her a reputation as the most organized medic in the battalion. What her fellow soldiers didn't know was that Maria's attention to detail came from 15 years of training that had nothing to do with Army Medical School. Before enlisting, Maria Rodriguez had been Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a trauma surgeon who had completed her residency at Johns Hopkins and specialized in emergency medicine in urban combat zones. She'd volunteered with Doctors Without Borders in Syria, Somalia, and Iraq, performing surgery under fire and saving lives in conditions that would have broken most people. She joined the Army not because she needed the training, but because she wanted to serve her country directly. The irony that the Army considered her too weak for combat while she'd spent years operating on gunshot wounds in active war zones was not lost on her. The military bureaucracy had other plans. Despite her medical credentials and combat experience, Maria's physical fitness scores had placed her in the bottom percentile for combat readiness. Her 5 feet 4 inches frame and inability to meet the male-oriented physical standards had relegated her to support roles, despite her protests that she'd performed emergency surgery while mortar rounds exploded outside her tent. The Army's logic was simple. If you can't carry a wounded soldier, you can't serve in combat. Maria had tried to explain that her value lay in keeping soldiers from becoming casualties in the first place, but regulations were regulations, so Maria had adapted. She'd spent 18 months proving herself through quiet competence, learning the names and medical histories of every soldier on the base, memorizing the terrain and tactical situation, and preparing for the moment when her real skills would be needed. She'd also spent those months building relationships with the soldiers who would later save her life, though none of them realized it at the time. Hey everyone, welcome to our channel. We're so excited to have you here with us today. If you're enjoying our content, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps us out. Share this video with your friends who might love it too. Your support means everything to us and keeps us motivated to create more amazing content for you. Thanks for being part of our awesome community. Now, let's jump right into today's video. The 3 men trapped in the collapsed bunker were part of Alpha Company's 2nd Squad. Corporal James Mitchell, a 23-year-old from Texas who joined the Army to pay for college. Private First Class David Chen, a 19-year-old from California who sent half his paycheck home to his immigrant parents, and Specialist Robert Thompson, a 26-year-old from Michigan who'd re-enlisted after his first tour because he believed in the mission. Maria had treated all three for minor injuries over the past months, and she knew their medical histories better than they did. Mitchell had a chronic knee injury from a parachute landing that had gone wrong during training. Chun was allergic to penicillin and had a history of panic attacks that he'd hidden from his commanding officers. Thompson had shrapnel fragments from an IED explosion still embedded in his shoulder, fragments that the Army surgeons had decided were too dangerous to remove. Maria knew these details because she'd spent months building detailed medical profiles of every soldier on the base, preparing for exactly this kind of emergency. The Taliban attack had been carefully planned and executed with military precision. Intelligence reports later revealed that the insurgents had been watching the base for weeks, studying patrol patterns and identifying vulnerabilities. They'd chosen to attack during the early morning shift change, when the base's defensive positions were momentarily undermanned. The initial mortar barrage had been followed by a coordinated assault on three sides, with the main force attacking from the north while smaller units provided covering fire from the east and west. Maria had been in the medical clinic when the first shells landed, organizing supplies for the day's missions. The explosion had thrown her against the wall, but her training had kicked in immediately. While other soldiers were still processing what was happening, Maria was already moving, grabbing her medical kit and heading toward the sound of gunfire. She'd learned in Syria that the first few minutes of any attack were crucial, and that medics who hesitated usually arrived too late to save lives. The collapsed bunker where Mitchell, Chun, and Thompson were trapped had been a defensive position, overlooking the valley approach. The Taliban had targeted it specifically because it controlled the high ground and provided overwatch for the entire base. The mortar round that had collapsed the bunker had been aimed with surgical precision, suggesting that the attackers had detailed intelligence about the base's defensive positions. Maria realized this as she approached the rubble, noting the accuracy of the strike and the strategic importance of the position. What she found when she reached the bunker made her blood run cold. The structure had pancaked with tons of concrete and steel beams crushing the fighting position. She could hear voices from beneath the debris, weak and growing weaker. Mitchell was calling for help, his voice strained with pain. Chun was making the shallow, rapid breathing sounds that Maria recognized as signs of a punctured lung. Thompson wasn't making any sound at all, which could mean he was unconscious or worse. Maria's medical training told her that the three soldiers had minutes, not hours, to survive. A collapsed bunker created a pocket of air that would quickly fill with dust and debris, making breathing difficult. The weight of the rubble could cause crush injuries that would lead to organ failure. Most critically, any soldier who was bleeding would quickly go into shock without immediate medical intervention. Maria had seen similar situations in Syria and knew that hesitation meant death, but Maria also knew that attempting a rescue would be suicide. The Taliban attack was ongoing, with automatic weapons fire echoing across the base. The collapsed bunker was in a forward position, exposed to enemy fire and separated from the main base by 50 meters of open ground. Any rescue attempt would require crossing that killing field while under direct observation from Taliban positions in the surrounding hills. The rational response would be to wait for the attack to end and then send a full rescue team with proper equipment. Maria Rodriguez had spent 15 years in emergency medicine, and she'd learned that sometimes the rational response was the wrong response. She'd operated on patients while hospitals were being shelled, performed emergency surgery in bombed-out buildings, and saved lives in conditions that military manuals would consider impossible. She'd joined the Army to serve her country, not to hide behind regulations when soldiers were dying. The fact that those soldiers had doubted her capabilities only made her more determined to prove them wrong. Maria looked at the collapsed bunker. listened to the weakening voices of the trapped soldiers, and made a decision that would either save 3 lives or cost 4. She began moving toward the rubble, her medical kit in one hand and a determination forged by years of saving lives. In impossible situations driving her forward. The Taliban fighters who had dismissed her as a non-combatant were about to discover that the most dangerous person on a battlefield is often the one who refuses to accept that a situation is hopeless. The base's emergency sirens were wailing. As Maria approached the collapsed position, their sound mixing with the crack of rifle fire and the distant thump of mortar. She could see muzzle flashes from the Taliban positions in the hills. And she knew that crossing the open ground to reach the bunker would expose her to direct enemy fire. But she also knew that Mitchell, Chun, and Thompson were running out of time, and that she was the only person on the base with the medical training and combat experience necessary to save them. As Maria reached the edge of the rubble pile, she could hear Mitchell's voice more clearly. He was conscious but in pain, probably with broken bones and internal injuries. Chun's breathing was becoming more labored, suggesting that his lung injury was getting worse. Thompson still wasn't responding, which meant he was either unconscious from blood loss or suffering from a head injury that required immediate attention. Maria's medical assessment told her that all 3 soldiers were in critical condition and would die without immediate intervention. The Taliban fighters controlling the high ground had a clear line of sight to the collapsed bunker, and Maria could see tracer rounds passing overhead as she began examining the rubble. The enemy was maintaining suppressive fire to prevent any rescue attempts, knowing that trapped soldiers would draw other soldiers into the kill zone. It was a tactical situation that military doctrine considered unwinnable. Exposed position, ongoing enemy fire, and casualties that couldn't be reached through conventional means. Maria Rodriguez had spent her entire adult life in situations that other people considered unwinnable. She'd performed emergency surgery while rockets exploded outside her operating room, saved lives in hospitals that were actively being targeted by enemy forces, and learned that sometimes the impossible was just another word for difficult. As she began moving rocks and debris with her bare hands, Maria knew that she was about to attempt something that would either validate her years of training or confirm the Army's assessment that she was too weak for combat operations. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed across the valley as Maria worked, but she knew that air support wouldn't arrive in time to save the trapped soldiers. Military doctrine required securing the landing zone before medical evacuation could proceed, and the Taliban fighters were still maintaining effective fire on the base. Maria was on her own, with nothing but her medical training, her combat experience, and the knowledge that 3 soldiers were depending on her to do what everyone else considered impossible. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Sentinel as Maria Rodriguez completed her 18th month of what the Army euphemistically called medical support duties. To her fellow soldiers, she was simply the quiet medic who worked the early shifts, always available for minor injuries and routine medical tasks, but never quite visible enough to be considered one of the team. Her small frame moved efficiently through the base's medical facilities, checking supplies, updating medical records, and maintaining the kind of meticulous organization that kept a forward operating base functioning. What none of her colleagues understood was that Maria's apparent invisibility was carefully cultivated. During her years with Doctors Without Borders, she'd learned that in dangerous situations, the most effective medical personnel were often those who could work without drawing attention. In Somalia, she'd performed surgery while warlords negotiated in the next room. In Syria, she'd saved lives while keeping a low profile that prevented her from becoming a target. The Army's assessment that she was too weak for combat had inadvertently given her the perfect cover for the kind of work she'd been doing for 15 years. Maria's daily routine began at 0400 with a comprehensive Review of the base's medical situation. She maintained detailed files on every soldier at FOB Sentinel, tracking not just their official medical records, but also their psychological state, their family situations, and their personal concerns. This information gathering wasn't officially part of her duties, but Maria had learned that effective medical care required understanding the whole person, not just their injuries. She knew that Corporal Mitchell had been having nightmares about his previous deployment, that Private Chun was worried about his parents' financial situation, and that Specialist Thompson was dealing with chronic pain he'd never reported to. Avoid being sent home. The base's morning briefings were held in the Tactical Operations Center, where Maria sat in the back corner, ostensibly there to report on medical readiness, but actually absorbing every detail about patrol routes, enemy activity, and tactical situations. The other soldiers had grown accustomed to her presence, treating her as part of the furniture rather than a potential combat asset. This suited Maria perfectly, as it allowed her to understand the base's operational rhythm and identify potential medical emergencies before they occurred. Captain Sarah Williams, the base's executive officer, had initially been skeptical of Maria's detailed medical preparations. During their first meeting, Williams had questioned why a support medic needed to know tactical details about patrol operations. Maria had explained that understanding mission parameters helped her prepare appropriate medical supplies, but the real reason was her recognition that in combat situations, medical emergencies rarely followed predictable patterns. The medic who understood the tactical situation was the one who could anticipate where and when casualties would occur. Maria's medical training had been supplemented by years of practical experience in environments where standard procedures were inadequate. In Iraq, she'd learned to perform emergency surgery using improvised equipment when proper surgical tools weren't available. In Afghanistan during her civilian deployment, she'd mastered the art of treating multiple casualties simultaneously while under fire. These skills weren't reflected in her Army medical training records, but they formed the foundation of her approach to military medicine. The soldiers of Alpha Company's 2nd Squad had initially viewed Maria with the mixture of respect and distance that characterized most interactions between combat soldiers and support personnel. Corporal Mitchell, with his Texas swagger and natural leadership abilities, had been polite but dismissive during their first medical interaction. Private Chun, barely out of high school and struggling with homesickness, had been more responsive to Maria's quiet competence. Specialist Thompson, a veteran of multiple deployments, had recognized something in Maria's demeanor that suggested more experience than her official record indicated. Over the months, Maria had carefully built relationships with the soldiers she would later save, though none of them realized the strategic nature of her approach. She'd treated Mitchell's knee injury with a combination of official medical protocol and techniques she'd learned from treating athletes in civilian practice. Her care had been thorough enough to keep him operational while avoiding the official medical documentation that might have ended his deployment. This balance between effective treatment and administrative discretion had earned Mitchell's grudging respect. Private Chun had required a different approach entirely. His youth and anxiety about his first deployment had made him reluctant to seek medical attention for issues that might be seen as weakness. Maria had recognized the signs of stress and had begun incorporating informal counseling into their medical interactions. She'd shared stories from her own deployments, carefully edited to omit details that might reveal her true background, and had helped Chun develop coping strategies for the psychological pressures of combat operations. Specialist Thompson had been the most challenging of the 3 soldiers, primarily because his experience made him naturally suspicious of medical personnel who seemed too interested in his welfare. Thompson had served multiple tours and had learned to be wary of medics who might document injuries that could end his military career. Maria had earned his trust through consistent competence and by demonstrating that she understood the difference Between treatable injuries and career-ending medical problems, the base's medical facilities were modest but well-equipped, reflecting the Army's understanding that forward operating bases required immediate medical response capabilities. Maria had spent considerable time familiarizing herself with every piece of equipment, not just the standard medical supplies, but also the emergency surgical tools that were theoretically reserved for trained surgeons. Her civilian credentials would have qualified her to use this equipment, but Army regulations required her to wait for properly certified medical personnel in all but the most extreme emergencies. Maria's preparation for potential mass casualty events had been methodical and largely invisible to her colleagues. She'd memorized the locations of every medical supply cache on the base, identified alternative routes to the medical facilities that would remain passable during an attack, and developed contingency plans for treating multiple casualties simultaneously. These preparations were based on her experience in civilian combat zones, where medical personnel often had to improvise solutions to problems that weren't covered in standard training manuals. The intelligence briefings that Maria attended as part of her official duties provided crucial information about enemy capabilities and tactics. The Taliban forces operating in the Kunar Valley were known for their sophisticated planning and their ability to coordinate complex attacks. Recent intelligence reports had indicated increased enemy activity in the surrounding hills, suggesting that an attack on FOB Sentinel was not just possible but probable. Maria had used this information to prepare additional medical supplies and to develop emergency protocols for treating casualties. During active combat operations, Maria's understanding of the base's defensive positions had been acquired through careful observation and informal conversations with the soldiers who manned them. The bunker that would later collapse had been constructed to provide overwatch for the valley approach, but Maria had noted that its position also made it vulnerable to direct mortar fire. The soldiers who manned the position had been rotated regularly, but Mitchell, Chun, and Thompson had drawn duty there frequently enough that Maria had become familiar with their specific responsibilities and vulnerabilities. The tactical situation in the Kunar Valley had been deteriorating for weeks, with increased enemy probing attacks and intelligence reports suggesting that a major assault was being planned. Maria had noticed the signs in the behavior of the soldiers she treated: increased requests for sleep aids, more frequent minor injuries that might have been psychosomatic, and a general level of tension that suggested everyone was expecting something to happen. These observations had prompted her to increase her medical preparations and to review emergency protocols with unusual thoroughness. Maria's combat experience with Doctors Without Borders had taught her that medical personnel in war zones needed to be prepared for situations that went far beyond standard medical training. She'd learned to read the signs of impending combat, to recognize the psychological markers that indicated soldiers were approaching their breaking point, and to distinguish between injuries that required immediate attention and those that could wait for proper medical facilities. These skills had been developed through years of practical experience in environments where mistakes cost lives. The morning of the attack, Maria had been completing her routine inventory when she'd noticed several indicators that suggested today would be different. The base's radio traffic had been more active than usual, with reports of enemy movement in the surrounding hills. The soldiers she'd encountered during her morning rounds had been more tense than usual, with the kind of focused alertness that experienced personnel developed before major combat operations. Most significantly, the 3 soldiers scheduled for bunker duty had all requested minor medical attention, suggesting they were psychologically preparing for something dangerous. Maria's medical kit had been prepared with unusual care that morning, though she hadn't consciously recognized why. She was being more thorough than usual. Her civilian combat experience had taught her to trust her instincts when they suggested that preparation would be important. She'd included additional supplies for treating traumatic injuries, had checked and rechecked her emergency surgical equipment, and had reviewed the locations of medical supply caches throughout the base. These preparations had been completed by 0530, just 17 minutes before the first mortar round landed. The soldiers who would later question Maria's physical capacity for combat operations had no way of knowing that she'd spent years in situations that would have tested the limits of most military personnel. Her work with Doctors Without Borders had required her to function effectively under extreme stress, to make life and death decisions with incomplete information, and to maintain professional competence while operating in environments where standard medical protocols were inadequate. These experiences had prepared her for exactly the kind of crisis that was about to unfold at FOB Sentinel. As Maria completed her morning preparations, she had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, she would be faced with a situation that would test every skill she'd developed over 15 years of emergency medical practice. The Taliban attack would create exactly the kind of crisis that Army doctrine considered impossible to resolve. Casualties trapped in an exposed position, ongoing enemy fire preventing conventional rescue operations, and medical emergencies that required immediate intervention. Maria Rodriguez, the medic who had been deemed too weak for combat operations, was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous situation is the one that everyone else considers hopeless. The first indication that something was wrong came at 0543 hours, when Maria noticed the unusual silence from the perimeter guard posts. During her months at FOB Sentinel, she developed an unconscious awareness of the base's normal rhythms, the subtle sounds that indicated everything was functioning as expected. The absence of routine radio chatter from the forward observation post struck her as significant, though she couldn't immediately identify why. Her hands continued organizing medical supplies, but her mind was already shifting into the heightened awareness state that had kept her alive in Somalia and Syria. The morning light was just beginning to illuminate the Kunar Valley when Maria heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Her body reacted before her conscious mind processed the sound, dropping her to the floor of the medical clinic as the first shells impacted the base's outer perimeter. The explosions were closer and more accurate than the random harassment fire that occasionally targeted FOB Sentinel, indicating a level of coordination and preparation that suggested this was not a routine attack. Maria's immediate response was to secure the medical facility for mass casualties, a procedure she'd performed countless times in civilian war zones, but never in her official Army capacity. She locked down the drug storage areas, moved critical medical equipment away from windows, and prepared the emergency surgical station that was theoretically reserved for qualified surgeons. Her movements were efficient and automatic, reflecting years of experience in combat medical situations that most Army medics would never encounter. The second wave of mortar rounds struck the base's defensive positions with surgical precision, and Maria realized that this attack had been planned. With detailed intelligence about FOB Sentinel's layout and vulnerabilities, the explosions were targeting specific structures rather than random areas, suggesting that the attackers had comprehensive knowledge of the base's defensive arrangements. This level of tactical sophistication indicated that the Taliban forces had been conducting surveillance for weeks or months, identifying key targets and timing their assault for maximum effectiveness. Maria's radio crackled with emergency communications as the base's defensive procedures activated. The calm, professional voices of the Tactical Operations Center contrasted sharply with the chaos of the ongoing bombardment, but Maria could detect the underlying tension that indicated this was a more serious situation than the occasional probing attacks that had characterized recent Taliban activity. The radio traffic confirmed her assessment that this was a coordinated assault involving multiple enemy positions and sophisticated planning. The third wave of mortar rounds targeted the base's communication facilities and medical areas, confirming Maria's suspicion that the attackers had detailed intelligence about FOB Sentinel's critical infrastructure. One round landed close enough to the medical clinic to shatter windows and fill the air with dust and debris. But Maria's preparation had protected the essential medical equipment from damage. She could hear secondary explosions from other areas of the base, indicating that fuel and ammunition storage areas were also being targeted. Through the medical clinic's reinforced windows, Maria could see soldiers moving to defensive positions. With the practiced efficiency of a unit that had trained for exactly this scenario, the base's defensive plan was being executed according to doctrine, with overlapping fields of fire and mutually supporting positions designed to repel a coordinated attack. However, Maria's experience in other combat zones had taught her that even the best defensive plans could be compromised by accurate intelligence and determined attackers. The radio traffic from the Tactical Operations Center indicated that the attack was developing on multiple fronts simultaneously, with the main assault coming from the north while smaller forces provided covering fire from the east and west. This tactical approach was consistent with Taliban doctrine for attacking fortified positions, but the coordination and timing suggested a level of planning that exceeded the capabilities of typical insurgent forces. Maria began to suspect that this attack was being conducted by experienced fighters with significant military training. Maria's medical training had included instruction in combat casualty care, but her civilian experience had taught her that textbook procedures were often inadequate for the realities of battlefield medicine. She'd learned to anticipate the types of injuries that would result from different types of attacks, to prepare for multiple casualties arriving simultaneously, and to prioritize treatment based on tactical circumstances rather than just medical need. These skills were about to be tested in ways that her army training had never anticipated. The sound of small arms fire indicated that Taliban forces had advanced close enough to the base perimeter to engage the defensive positions directly. Maria could distinguish between the crack of American M4 rifles and the distinctive sound of the K-47s, suggesting that the attackers had penetrated the outer security perimeter and were now engaging the base's main defensive line. The intensity of the gunfire was increasing, indicating that the Taliban forces were committed to this assault and were not planning to withdraw after a brief engagement. Maria's radio began receiving casualty reports from various positions around the base. But the most urgent transmission came from the forward observation bunker that overlooked the valley approach. The voice belonged to Corporal Mitchell, and his transmission was broken by static and the sound of explosions. But Maria could make out enough words to understand that the bunker had taken a direct hit and that there were multiple casualties. Trapped inside the collapsed structure, the tactical situation was becoming clearer as more RADIO reports reached the medical clinic. The Taliban attack was following a classic pattern designed to isolate key defensive positions and prevent mutual support between different areas of the base. The forward observation bunker was particularly vulnerable because its position required it to be separated from the main defensive line, making it difficult to reinforce or evacuate if it came under direct attack. Maria realized that the soldiers trapped in the bunker were facing a situation that standard military doctrine considered nearly impossible to resolve. Maria's medical assessment of the situation was complicated by her understanding of the tactical circumstances. The collapsed bunker was located in an area that was exposed to direct enemy fire, making conventional rescue operations extremely dangerous. The Taliban forces controlling the high ground had clear lines of sight to the bunker's position, and any rescue attempt would require personnel to cross 50 meters of open ground while under direct observation from enemy positions. Military doctrine would typically require suppressing enemy fire before attempting casualty evacuation, but the Taliban positions were well protected and would be difficult to neutralize quickly. The radio transmissions from the bunker were becoming weaker and less frequent, indicating that the trapped soldiers were either losing consciousness or that their radio equipment was failing. Maria's medical training told her that casualties trapped in a collapsed structure would face multiple life-threatening conditions: crush injuries from falling debris, respiratory problems from dust and debris in the air, and potential bleeding that could lead to shock and death. The longer the soldiers remained trapped, the less likely they were to survive, even if they were eventually rescued. Maria's experience with Doctors Without Borders had included several situations where she'd had to treat casualties in locations that were exposed to enemy fire or otherwise tactically dangerous. She'd learned that sometimes the medical imperative to save lives conflicted with tactical considerations about safety and risk, and that these conflicts often had to be resolved by individual medical personnel, making decisions that went beyond their official training and responsibilities. The situation developing at FOB Sentinel was exactly the kind of crisis that required someone to make decisions that transcended normal procedures. The base's commanding officer was coordinating the overall defensive response from the tactical operations center, but Maria knew that the decisions about casualty evacuation would ultimately be made at the squad and platoon level by the soldiers who were actually in contact with the enemy. The radio traffic indicated that the unit responsible for the forward observation bunker was pinned down by enemy fire and unable to mount an immediate rescue operation. Standard military procedure would be to wait for air support or artillery to suppress enemy positions before attempting casualty evacuation. Maria's assessment of the tactical situation was that air support would not arrive in time to save the soldiers trapped in the bunker. The helicopters that could provide close air support were based at larger installations that were at least 30 minutes away, and the process of coordinating airstrikes in close proximity to friendly forces would require additional time for planning and safety checks. The soldiers in the bunker had minutes, not hours, to survive their injuries and the hazardous conditions inside the collapsed structure. The radio traffic from other positions around the base indicated that the Taliban attack was being conducted with a level of tactical sophistication that suggested extensive planning and preparation. The attackers were maintaining coordinated fire on multiple targets, preventing the base's defenders from concentrating their efforts on any single threat. This tactical approach was designed to create exactly the kind of situation that was developing around the forward observation bunker: casualties in an exposed position that could not be reached through conventional means. Maria's medical training had emphasized the importance of triage in mass casualty situations, the process of prioritizing treatment based on the likelihood of survival and the resources required for effective care. However, her civilian experience had taught her that sometimes the most important medical decisions were about when to abandon standard procedures and attempt treatments that had little chance of success, but were the only hope for saving lives. The situation at the forward observation bunker was exactly the kind of crisis that required someone to make decisions that went beyond normal medical protocols. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance indicated that military reinforcements were en route to FOB Sentinel, but Maria knew that the tactical situation would prevent immediate medical evacuation of the casualties in the bunker. Military helicopters could not land in areas that were under direct enemy fire, and the process of securing a landing zone would require neutralizing the Taliban positions that controlled the high ground around the base. This tactical reality meant that the soldiers trapped in the bunker would have to be rescued and treated using only the resources immediately available at FOB Sentinel. Maria's radio received another transmission from the bunker, this one barely audible through the static and interference. She could make out Corporal Mitchell's voice, but his words were slurred and difficult to understand, suggesting that he was suffering from head injuries or shock. The transmission lasted only a few seconds before cutting off entirely, leaving Maria with the realization that the soldiers in the bunker were rapidly approaching the point where medical intervention would no longer be effective. The Tactical Operations Center was coordinating multiple aspects of the base's defense simultaneously. But Maria could hear the strain in the radio communications as the situation became increasingly complex. The Taliban attack was achieving its tactical objectives by creating multiple crises that had to be addressed simultaneously, stretching the base's resources and forcing difficult decisions about priorities and resource allocation. The soldiers trapped in the bunker were becoming one of several urgent problems that had to be resolved with limited personnel and equipment. Maria's experience in civilian combat zones had taught her that the most effective medical personnel were often those who could function independently when standard support systems were overwhelmed or unavailable. She'd learned to make medical decisions based on incomplete information, to improvise treatments using available resources, and to accept responsibility for outcomes that might not be achievable through conventional means. The situation developing at FOB Sentinel was exactly the kind of crisis that required someone to act decisively despite uncertain odds and significant personal risk. The radio traffic from the Tactical Operations Center indicated that the base's defensive plan was holding, but that the Taliban forces were maintaining their assault with a level of determination that suggested they were committed to achieving specific tactical objectives. The attack on the forward observation bunker was not just a random target of opportunity, but part of a coordinated plan to neutralize the base's ability to control the surrounding terrain. This tactical reality meant that the enemy forces would continue to maintain fire on the bunker's position, making any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. Maria's medical assessment was that the soldiers trapped in the bunker had perhaps 10 minutes remaining before their injuries, and the environmental hazards inside the collapsed structure would make survival impossible. The tactical situation meant that conventional rescue operations would require at least 30 minutes to organize and execute, assuming that enemy positions could be suppressed effectively. The mathematics of the situation were clear. Someone would have to attempt an immediate rescue using unconventional methods, or the 3 soldiers would die despite being only 50 meters away from medical care. As Maria prepared to leave the relative safety of the medical clinic, she understood that she was about to attempt something that would either validate her years of combat medical experience or confirm the Army's assessment that she was unsuited for dangerous operations. The soldiers trapped in the bunker had no way of knowing that their survival depended on a medic who had been deemed too weak for combat, but who had actually spent years saving lives in situations that most military personnel would never encounter. Maria's decision to attempt the rescue crystallized as she listened to the increasingly desperate radio transmissions from the collapsed bunker. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with Taliban forces maintaining effective fire on the position, while the base's defenders were pinned down by coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Every second of delay reduced the chances that Mitchell, Chun, and Thompson would survive their injuries, but the 50 meters of open ground between the medical clinic and the bunker might as well have been a mile under the current circumstances. The route to the bunker required crossing the base's main courtyard, an area that was normally bustling with activity, but was now swept by enemy fire from the surrounding hills. Maria could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different Taliban positions, their weapons trained on the courtyard and the approaches to the defensive positions. The enemy fighters had clearly identified the bunker as a priority target and were maintaining suppressive fire to prevent any rescue attempts. Standard military doctrine would consider this a textbook example of a tactically impossible situation. Maria's medical kit contained the standard supplies for treating battlefield injuries, but her civilian experience had taught her to supplement these with additional items that might be needed for emergency surgery under field conditions. She added extra gauze and pressure bandages, morphine for pain management, and a portable surgical kit that she'd acquired during her deployment with Doctors Without Borders. The weight of the additional supplies would slow her down, but the alternative was reaching the bunker without the tools necessary to save lives. The first challenge was simply getting out of the medical clinic. without being detected by the enemy observers in the hills. Maria had studied the base's layout during her months of service, identifying blind spots and covered routes that could be used for movement during attacks. The clinic's rear exit opened onto a service area that was partially protected by concrete barriers, providing a covered approach to the main courtyard. However, the final 50 meters to the bunker would require crossing open ground under direct enemy observation. Maria's movement across the service area was careful and deliberate, using the concrete barriers and equipment storage areas to mask her approach. She could hear the constant crack of rifle fire as the base's defenders engaged Taliban positions, but she could also hear the distinctive sound of incoming rounds striking the ground near her position. The enemy had clearly identified movement in the service area and was attempting to engage targets of opportunity. Maria's small size and careful movement had allowed her to avoid detection so far, but she knew that advantage would disappear once she entered the open courtyard. The tactical situation around the bunker was becoming increasingly desperate as Maria approached the edge of the covered area. She could see the collapsed structure clearly now, with tons of concrete and steel beams creating a debris field that extended several meters from the original position. The bunker's defensive position had been completely destroyed, but somewhere underneath the rubble were 3 soldiers who were depending on her to reach them before their injuries became fatal. The sight of the destruction made Maria realize that the rescue operation would be even more complex than she'd anticipated. Maria's radio crackled with communications from the Tactical Operations Center, coordinating defensive fires and requesting air support for the overall battle. However, there was no specific mention of rescue operations for the bunker casualties, suggesting that the command structure had written off the trapped soldiers as tactically irretrievable. This assessment was understandable given the tactical situation, but it also meant that Maria would be operating without official support or coordination with other units. She was truly on her own in attempting what everyone else considered impossible. The sound of helicopter rotors was growing louder, indicating that air support was approaching FOB Sentinel. But Maria knew that the tactical situation would prevent immediate assistance with casualty evacuation. Military helicopters required secure landing zones and clear airspace, conditions that would not exist until the Taliban attack was repelled and enemy positions were neutralized. The soldiers in the bunker could not wait for the tactical situation to improve. They needed immediate medical attention that could only be provided by someone willing to cross the killing field that separated them from help. Maria's approach to the open courtyard was methodical, and based on her experience moving through combat zones where any mistake could be fatal. She identified covered positions that could provide temporary protection during the crossing, timing her movements to coincide with periods of reduced enemy fire. The Taliban positions were concentrating their fire on the base's defensive positions, but they were also maintaining observation of the courtyard area, and would certainly engage any movement they detected. Maria's survival would depend on speed, timing, and the element of surprise. The first phase of the crossing required Maria to move from the service area to a damaged vehicle that was located approximately halfway between the medical clinic and the bunker. The vehicle had been struck by shrapnel from the earlier mortar bombardment and would provide limited protection, but it was the only covered position available in the open courtyard. Maria's movement would have to be fast enough to avoid being targeted by enemy observers, but careful enough to avoid tripping or making noise that might attract attention. Maria's sprint across the first section of open ground was the longest, 20 seconds of her life. She could hear bullets impacting the ground around her as Taliban fighters detected her movement and attempted to engage her position. The sound of incoming rounds was terrifyingly close, but her small size and erratic movement pattern made her a difficult target for enemy marksmen, who were firing from concealed positions several hundred meters away. She reached the damaged vehicle just as a burst of automatic weapons fire struck the ground where she'd been running. The damaged vehicle provided temporary cover, but also created new tactical problems. Maria could see that the Taliban positions had adjusted their fire to target her location, with rounds striking the vehicle and sending shrapnel ricocheting in all directions. The enemy fighters had clearly identified her as a priority target and were concentrating their efforts on preventing her from reaching the bunker. The tactical situation was rapidly becoming untenable, but Maria knew that retreating would doom the soldiers who were depending on her to reach them. Maria's radio received a transmission from the Tactical Operations Center directing all personnel to remain in covered positions until air support could suppress enemy fires. The message was clearly intended for her, indicating that her rescue attempt had been observed and that the command structure was attempting to prevent what they considered a suicidal mission. However, Maria's medical training and civilian experience had taught her that sometimes the most important decisions were made by individuals who were willing to accept risks that others considered unacceptable. The second phase of the crossing required Maria to move from the damaged vehicle to the bunker itself, a distance of approximately 30 meters across completely open ground. This section of the courtyard offered no cover or concealment, and Maria would be exposed to direct enemy fire for the entire distance. The Taliban positions had clear lines of sight to this area and had been maintaining suppressive fire specifically to prevent rescue attempts. Maria's survival would depend entirely on speed and the possibility that enemy marksmen would be surprised by her sudden movement. Maria's preparation for the final sprint included dropping non-essential equipment to reduce weight and reviewing the exact route she would take to the bunker. She identified the specific point where she would enter the debris field and the approximate location where she believed the trapped soldiers were located. The timing of her movement would be crucial, as she would need to cross the open ground. During a brief lull in enemy fire while the Taliban fighters were reloading or adjusting their positions, the moment Maria chose for her final sprint coincided with a period of increased activity from the base's defensive positions, as American forces attempted to suppress enemy fire with concentrated rifle volleys. The tactical situation provided a brief window of opportunity as Taliban fighters were forced to seek cover from the defensive fires, reducing their ability to maintain accurate observation of the courtyard area. Maria's movement across the final 30 meters was the most dangerous phase of her rescue attempt, requiring her to cross open ground while carrying medical supplies and moving toward a position that was under direct enemy observation. Maria's sprint to the bunker was accompanied by the sound of bullets striking the ground around her and the distinctive crack of rounds passing close to her position. The Taliban fighters had detected her movement and were attempting to engage her with concentrated fire, but her small size and erratic movement pattern made her a difficult target. She could feel the heat of rounds passing close to her body and could hear the sound of ricochets from the debris field as she approached the collapsed structure. The debris field around the bunker was more extensive than Maria had realized from her observation position, with chunks of concrete and twisted metal, creating a hazardous obstacle course that would complicate her approach to the trapped soldiers. The collapse had created a complex pile of rubble that would require careful navigation to avoid further collapse or injury. Maria's medical training included instruction in urban rescue techniques, but her civilian experience in bombed buildings had provided more practical knowledge about moving through unstable structures. Maria's entry into the debris field was complicated by ongoing enemy fire and the unstable nature of the collapsed structure. She could hear voices from underneath the rubble, indicating that at least some of the trapped soldiers were still conscious, but the sounds were weak and difficult to locate precisely. The collapse had created multiple air pockets within the debris, making it difficult to determine exactly where the soldiers were located and how they could be reached safely. Hey everyone! Welcome to our channel. We're so excited to have you here with us today. If you're enjoying our content, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps us out. Share this video with your friends who might love it too. Your support means everything to us and keeps us motivated to create more amazing content for you. Thanks for being part of our awesome community. Now, let's jump right into today's video. The tactical situation around the bunker remained dangerous as Maria began her search for the trapped soldiers. Taliban fighters were maintaining observation of the position and continuing to fire at any movement they detected. The debris field provided some protection from direct fire, but Maria was still exposed to ricochets and shrapnel from rounds striking the concrete and metal around her. Her medical training had prepared her for treating casualties under fire, but the combination of enemy action and structural instability created unique challenges that required improvisation and risk assessment. Maria's search for the trapped soldiers was guided by the sound of voices and the locations where she believed their defensive positions had been before the collapse. She called out to the soldiers, identifying herself and attempting to establish communication that would help her locate their exact positions. The responses she received were weak and sometimes incoherent, indicating that the soldiers were suffering from serious injuries and possibly shock from blood loss or trauma. The first soldier Maria located was Corporal Mitchell, who was trapped under a large concrete beam that had fallen across his lower body. Mitchell was conscious but in obvious pain, and his attempts to communicate were limited by what appeared to be internal injuries and possible concussion. Maria's medical assessment indicated that Mitchell had sustained crush injuries to his legs and possibly his pelvis, conditions that would require immediate treatment to prevent shock and blood loss. The beam that had him trapped was too heavy for Maria to move alone, requiring her to develop an alternative approach to providing medical care. Maria's treatment of Mitchell's injuries was complicated by the tactical situation and the limited space available in the debris field. She could not move the concrete beam that was trapping him, but she could provide medical care that would stabilize his condition until additional help arrived. Her medical kit contained morphine for pain management and pressure bandages that could be applied to accessible wounds. However, the most serious injuries were located beneath the concrete beam, making comprehensive treatment impossible under the current circumstances. The second soldier Maria located was Private Chun, who was trapped in a different section of the debris field approximately 10 meters from Mitchell's position. Chun was conscious but experiencing severe respiratory distress, indicating possible lung injuries from the collapse. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and he was unable to speak clearly, suggesting that he might have sustained damage to his chest cavity from falling debris. Maria's medical assessment indicated that Chun required immediate treatment for what appeared to be a pneumothorax, a condition that could be fatal without proper medical intervention. Maria's treatment of Chun's respiratory emergency required her to perform a medical procedure that was technically beyond her official scope of practice as an Army medic. However, her civilian experience as a trauma surgeon had prepared her for exactly this type of emergency, and she had the necessary equipment in her medical kit to perform the procedure. The tactical situation made the treatment more complex, as she had to work quickly while remaining aware of ongoing enemy fire and the possibility of further structural collapse. The third soldier, Specialist Thompson, was located in the most dangerous section of the debris field, underneath a pile of concrete and metal that appeared to be structurally unstable. Thompson was unconscious and unresponsive, indicating that he had sustained serious head injuries or was suffering from shock due to blood loss. Maria's approach to Thompson's position required careful navigation through unstable debris while maintaining awareness of the tactical situation and the ongoing enemy fire that continued to target the bunker area. Maria's medical assessment of Thompson's condition was complicated by his unconscious state and the limited access to his injuries. She could determine that he was breathing, but could not assess the extent of his injuries without moving some of the debris that was covering his body. The structural instability of the pile made this approach dangerous, as any disturbance might cause further collapse that could injure both Thompson and Maria. Her medical training and civilian experience had prepared her for difficult decisions about risk and treatment priorities. But the current situation required her to make choices that would determine whether any of the soldiers would survive. Maria's assessment of the 3 trapped soldiers revealed the full scope of the medical crisis she was facing. Mitchell's crush injuries were causing internal bleeding that would lead to shock and death within minutes without immediate intervention. Chun's pneumothorax was preventing him from breathing effectively, and his lips were already showing the blue tinge that indicated dangerous oxygen deprivation. Thompson's head injuries had left him unconscious and unresponsive, with blood seeping from his ears in a pattern that suggested severe brain trauma. Each soldier required immediate, complex medical attention that would normally be provided by a full surgical team in a controlled environment. The tactical situation was deteriorating as Taliban forces concentrated their fire on the bunker position, apparently recognizing that American personnel were attempting a rescue operation. Maria could hear the sound of bullets striking the concrete debris around her, with ricochets sending fragments of metal and stone flying in all directions. The enemy had clearly identified her location and was attempting to prevent her from providing medical care to the trapped soldiers. Every moment she spent in the debris field increased the risk that she would become a casualty herself, but abandoning the rescue would guarantee that all 3 soldiers would die. Maria's medical training had emphasized the importance of triage in mass casualty situations, but her civilian experience had taught her that sometimes the most critical decisions involved abandoning standard procedures to save lives that would otherwise be lost. The current situation required her to provide 3 different types of emergency medical care simultaneously, using improvised equipment and techniques that went far beyond her official training as an Army medic. The complexity of the medical challenges was compounded by the ongoing enemy fire and the structural instability of the collapsed bunker. The first critical decision Maria faced was determining which soldier to treat first, knowing that the time spent on one patient would reduce the chances of survival for the other 2. Mitchell's crush injuries were causing progressive blood loss that would be fatal within minutes, but his injuries were also the most accessible and potentially treatable with the equipment she had available. Chun's respiratory emergency was immediately life-threatening, but treating his pneumothorax would require her to perform a procedure that would take several minutes and would expose her to enemy fire. Thompson's head injuries were the most serious, but they were also the least likely to respond to field treatment. Maria's decision to begin with Chun's respiratory emergency was based on her assessment that his condition was immediately life-threatening, but also the most likely to respond to emergency treatment. The procedure for treating a pneumothorax involved inserting a needle into the chest cavity to release trapped air that was preventing the lung from expanding properly. This was a technique that Maria had performed countless times in civilian trauma centers, but never under enemy fire in a collapsed building with improvised equipment. The risk of making the injury worse through improper technique was significant, but the alternative was watching Chun suffocate. The procedure required Maria to locate the specific anatomical landmarks on Chun's chest while working in a cramped space with limited visibility and constant awareness of the tactical situation around her. She used her hands to feel for the correct insertion point between his ribs, sterilized the area with antiseptic from her medical kit, and prepared the needle that would release the trapped air from his chest cavity. Chun's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, and Maria could see that his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The procedure had to be performed immediately, or it would be too late to save his life. Maria's insertion of the needle into convulsively Chun's chest cavity was performed with the precision that came from years of trauma surgery, but the tactical situation made the procedure far more complex than any she had performed in civilian practice. She had to maintain steady hands while bullets struck the debris around her, judge the correct depth of insertion without proper lighting, and monitor Chun's response to the treatment while remaining aware of the ongoing enemy fire. The sound of escaping air indicated that the procedure had been successful, and Chun's breathing immediately became less labored. The immediate improvement in Chun's condition allowed Maria to turn her attention to Mitchell's crush injuries, which were causing progressive blood loss that would soon become fatal. The concrete beam that had fallen across his lower body was too heavy for her to move, but she could provide medical care that would stabilize his condition and prevent him from going into shock. Her medical kit contained pressure bandages and hemostatic agents that could control bleeding from accessible wounds, but the most serious injuries were located beneath the concrete beam, where she could not reach them. Maria's treatment of Mitchell's injuries required her to improvise solutions using the limited equipment available in her medical kit. She applied pressure bandages to the wounds she could reach, administered morphine for pain management, and used hemostatic powder to control bleeding from smaller lacerations. However, the most critical aspect of his treatment was preventing shock from blood loss, which required maintaining his blood pressure and fluid levels until more comprehensive medical care could be provided. Maria started an intravenous line using equipment from her medical kit, a procedure that was complicated by Mitchell's position under the debris and the ongoing enemy fire. The tactical situation around the bunker was becoming increasingly dangerous, as Taliban forces concentrated their efforts on preventing the rescue operation. Maria could hear the sound of automatic weapons fire striking the concrete debris with increasing frequency, and she could see muzzle flashes from multiple enemy positions in the surrounding hills. The enemy fighters had clearly recognized that American personnel were attempting to rescue the trapped soldiers, and they were determined to prevent the operation from succeeding. The volume of fire was making it difficult for Maria to move between the different casualty positions safely. Maria's approach to treating Thompson's head injuries was complicated by his unconscious state and the limited access to his position under the pile of debris. She had to carefully move pieces of concrete and metal to reach him, a process that was dangerous because the pile appeared to be structurally unstable. Any disturbance could cause further collapse that would injure both Thompson and herself, but she could not assess or treat his injuries without clearing some of the debris. Her movements had to be deliberate and careful, testing each piece of debris before moving it to ensure that she was not triggering a collapse. Thompson's injuries were more severe than Maria had initially realized, with evidence of skull fractures and possible brain trauma that would require immediate surgical intervention to prevent death. However, the type of surgery needed was beyond what could be performed in a field environment. Even with Maria's extensive civilian experience, she could provide basic medical care to stabilize his condition, but his survival would depend on immediate evacuation to a proper medical facility with neurosurgical capabilities. The tactical situation made such evacuation impossible, creating a medical crisis that had no good solutions. Maria's assessment of Thompson's condition revealed that he was suffering from increased intracranial pressure caused by bleeding inside his skull, a condition that would be fatal without immediate surgical intervention. The pressure was building as blood accumulated in the closed space of his skull, compressing his brain tissue and preventing it from functioning properly. Maria's medical training had included instruction in recognizing the signs of this condition, but her civilian experience had taught her that field treatment was usually ineffective without proper surgical equipment and facilities. The sound of helicopter rotors was growing louder, indicating that air support was approaching Phobe Sentinel. But Maria knew that the tactical situation would prevent immediate medical evacuation. Military helicopters could not land in areas under enemy fire, and the process of securing a landing zone would require neutralizing the Taliban positions that controlled the high ground around the base. The soldiers in the bunker could not wait for the tactical situation to improve. They needed immediate medical attention that could only be provided by someone willing to work under fire. Maria's radio crackled with communications from the Tactical Operations Center, but the transmissions were difficult to understand due to interference from the ongoing battle. She could make out enough words to understand that air support was being coordinated and that ground forces were attempting to suppress enemy fire, but there was no specific mention of rescue operations for the bunker casualties. The command structure appeared to be focusing on the overall tactical situation rather than the specific medical emergency that was developing in the collapsed bunker. The medical supplies in Maria's kit were being depleted as she worked to stabilize all 3 soldiers simultaneously. She had used most of her pressure bandages on Mitchell's injuries, administered morphine to manage pain for both conscious soldiers, and used significant amounts of medical tape and gauze to secure the treatments she had provided. The remaining supplies would be insufficient for prolonged treatment, but they might be enough to keep the soldiers alive until additional help arrived, or until she could evacuate them to the base medical facility. Maria's recognition that she would have to evacuate the soldiers herself came as she realized that no conventional rescue operation was possible under the current tactical circumstances. The Taliban forces were maintaining effective fire on the bunker position, and the base's defenders were pinned down by attacks from multiple directions. Air support would not be available for several minutes, and ground-based rescue operations would require personnel to cross the same 50 meters of open ground that Maria had traversed. The mathematical reality was that the soldiers would die from their injuries before conventional help could reach them. Arya realized that the tactical situation was continuing to deteriorate. Enemy fire was increasing in intensity, and she could hear the sound of mortar rounds impacting other areas of the base. The Taliban forces were escalating their attack, possibly in response to her rescue operations, or as part of their overall tactical plan. The increasing violence of the battle made the final evacuation of Thompson even more dangerous and urgent. Maria's medical assessment of Mitchell's condition after reaching the damaged vehicle revealed that the evacuation had caused some additional bleeding, but that his overall condition was stable enough to justify the risk of the movement. She applied fresh pressure bandages to wounds that had reopened during the crossing and administered additional morphine to manage his pain. Mitchell was conscious and alert, and he attempted to communicate his gratitude for her rescue efforts. Though his words were difficult to understand due to his injuries and the medication, the tactical situation around the bunker was becoming increasingly complex. As Maria prepared for the final evacuation, Thompson's position was the most dangerous of the 3 casualties, located in an area of the debris field that was particularly exposed to enemy fire. Additionally, Thompson's head injuries had left him unconscious and unable to assist in his own evacuation, making him a complete dead weight that would be even more difficult to carry than Mitchell. Maria's physical reserves were already depleted from the previous evacuations, and she was beginning to question whether she had the strength to complete the final rescue. Maria's return to the bunker for Thompson required her to cross the open ground for the 4th time, but her movements were now being anticipated by enemy forces who had established a pattern of her rescue operations. The Taliban marksmen were maintaining constant observation of the route, and they began firing at her position before she had fully committed to the crossing. Maria was forced to move in short rushes between available cover, using whatever concealment she could find to break up the predictable pattern of her movement. The approach to Thompson's position within the debris field was more hazardous than the previous rescues because of the unstable nature of the rubble pile that covered him. Maria had to carefully remove pieces of concrete and metal to access his position, a process that was dangerous because any disturbance could cause further collapse. The structural instability of the pile was compounded by the vibrations from ongoing explosions and the impact of enemy fire on the surrounding area. Maria's movements had to be deliberate and careful, testing each piece of debris before moving it to ensure that she was not triggering a collapse. Thompson's condition was worse than Maria had feared, with evidence of severe brain trauma that would require immediate surgical intervention to prevent death. His pupils were dilated and unresponsive, indicating increased intracranial pressure that was compressing his brain tissue. Maria's medical training told her that Thompson's injuries were likely fatal without immediate neurosurgical intervention. But her experience with battlefield casualties had taught her that sometimes patients could survive injuries that appeared hopeless. The question was whether she could evacuate him quickly enough to get him to proper medical care. The preparation for Thompson's evacuation was complicated by his unconscious state and the severity of his injuries. Maria had to position him for carrying while protecting his head and neck from further trauma, a process that was difficult in the confined space of the debris field. She also had to prepare for the possibility that the movement would cause increased bleeding or other complications that could be immediately fatal. Thompson's weight was similar to Mitchell's, but his unconscious state made him more difficult to position and carry effectively. Maria's lifting of Thompson required her to use every remaining ounce of her strength, as her previous evacuations had depleted her physical reserves. The process was further complicated by the need to protect his head and neck injuries while maneuvering through the unstable debris field. Thompson's unconscious state meant that he could not assist in any way, making him a complete dead weight that threatened to unbalance Maria with every step. The physical demands were enormous, and Maria could feel her muscles trembling with fatigue as she prepared to begin the final crossing. The evacuation of Thompson across the open courtyard was accomplished through sheer determination and the knowledge that failure would result in his death. Maria's strength was nearly exhausted, and she was forced to move more slowly than in the previous evacuations, making her an easier target for enemy marksmen. The Taliban forces concentrated their fire on her position, recognizing that this was likely her final rescue attempt. Bullets struck the ground around her with increasing frequency, and Maria could hear the distinctive crack of rounds passing close to her body. Maria's movement across the courtyard with Thompson was interrupted by a burst of automatic weapons fire that forced her to seek cover behind a piece of damaged equipment. The pause allowed her to rest briefly and assess Thompson's condition, but it also gave the enemy marksmen time to adjust their fire for her likely route. The tactical situation was becoming untenable, with enemy forces maintaining effective fire on her position and preventing her from completing the evacuation. Maria realized that she would have to abandon conventional movement techniques and attempt something more desperate. The final phase of Thompson's evacuation required Maria to move in a series of short rushes, using whatever cover was available to break up the predictable pattern of her movement. She carried Thompson for short distances before seeking cover, then repeated the process until she reached the damaged vehicle. The technique was physically exhausting and tactically risky, but it was the only way to complete the evacuation under the current circumstances. Maria's strength was nearly gone, and she was operating on pure determination and the knowledge that Thompson would die if she failed. Maria's successful evacuation of all 3 soldiers to the damaged vehicle represented the completion of the rescue phase of her operation, but it also marked the beginning of an even more challenging medical crisis. She now had 3 critically injured soldiers in a position that provided limited cover from enemy fire, and she was the only medical personnel available to treat their injuries. The tactical situation was continuing to deteriorate, with enemy forces maintaining pressure on the base and showing no signs of withdrawing. Maria's medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and she was physically depleted from the evacuations. The medical triage that Maria conducted at the damaged vehicle revealed that all 3 soldiers required immediate medical attention that exceeded what she could provide in the field. Mitchell's internal bleeding was being controlled by the pressure bandages and hemostatic agents, but he needed surgery to repair the damage to his pelvis and internal organs. Chun's respiratory emergency had been stabilized, but he required monitoring and possibly additional intervention if his condition deteriorated. Thompson's head injuries were the most serious, requiring immediate neurosurgical intervention that could only be provided at a major medical facility. Maria's assessment of the tactical situation indicated that conventional medical evacuation was still impossible due to ongoing enemy fire and the lack of secure landing zones for helicopters. The base's defenders were continuing to engage Taliban forces, but the enemy had established strong positions that would be difficult to neutralize quickly. Maria realized that she would have to find a way to move the soldiers to the base medical facility using ground transportation, despite the tactical risks involved in such movement. The sound of approaching aircraft indicated that air support was finally arriving at Phoebe Sentinel, but Maria knew that the tactical situation would require time to resolve before medical evacuation could proceed. The soldiers she had rescued could not wait for the tactical situation to improve. They needed immediate medical attention that could only be provided at the base medical facility. Maria's assessment was that she had perhaps 30 minutes to get the soldiers to proper medical care before their injuries became fatal. Regardless of the treatment she could provide in the field, Maria's decision to attempt ground evacuation of the 3 soldiers represented the final phase of her rescue operation, but it also involved risks that were even greater than the original rescue attempts. She would have to transport 3 critically injured soldiers across a base that was under attack, using vehicles that would be vulnerable to enemy fire, and coordinate with base defenders who were engaged in active combat operations. The success of the evacuation would depend on her ability to provide medical care while managing the tactical situation and the physical demands of moving multiple casualties simultaneously. Maria's assessment of available transportation options was limited by the tactical situation and the ongoing enemy fire that swept the base's vehicle staging area. The damaged vehicle that had provided cover during her rescue operations was inoperable, with engine damage from shrapnel and flat tires that would prevent it from reaching the medical facility. However, approximately 30 meters from their current position was a military ambulance that had been moved to a protected position during the initial attack. The ambulance appeared to be undamaged, but reaching it would require another movement across open ground under enemy observation. The tactical situation around the vehicle staging area was complicated by the Taliban's apparent recognition that Maria was attempting to evacuate casualties. Enemy fire was being concentrated on the areas around potential evacuation routes, with marksmen specifically targeting vehicles that could be used for medical evacuation. The Taliban forces had clearly identified the importance of preventing casualty evacuation, understanding that successful rescue operations would affect the morale and effectiveness of the base's defenders. Maria's movement to the ambulance would be anticipated and would likely draw concentrated enemy fire. Maria's medical assessment of the 3 soldiers indicated that their conditions were stable enough for transportation but deteriorating rapidly, enough that delays could be fatal. Mitchell's internal bleeding had been controlled by pressure bandages and hemostatic agents, but his blood pressure was dropping and his pulse was becoming weak and rapid. Chun's respiratory function had improved with the chest tube, but his breathing was still labored and his oxygen saturation was marginal. Thompson remained unconscious with signs of increasing intracranial pressure that would require immediate surgical intervention. The preparation for the movement to the ambulance required Maria to consider how to transport 3 critically injured soldiers across open ground while providing medical care and protection from enemy fire. The standard approach would be to move 1 soldier at a time, but the tactical situation made multiple crossings extremely dangerous and time-consuming. Maria's alternative plan was to move all 3 soldiers simultaneously, Using a combination of carrying techniques and tactical movement that would minimize exposure to enemy fire while maintaining medical care, Maria's improvised transportation system involved using a stretcher from the damaged vehicle to carry Thompson, who was unconscious and most vulnerable to further injury from rough handling. Mitchell would be supported by Maria as he attempted to walk, though his crush injuries made weight-bearing extremely difficult. Chun would move independently but with Maria's assistance, as his chest injury limited his mobility but did not prevent him from participating in his own evacuation. The coordination required for this movement was complex, requiring Maria to manage medical care, tactical awareness, and physical assistance simultaneously. The timing of the movement to the ambulance coincided with a period of intense activity. From the base's defensive positions, as American forces launched a coordinated counterattack against Taliban positions in the surrounding hills. The tactical situation provided a brief window of opportunity as enemy fire was diverted to engage the attacking American forces, reducing the immediate threat to the evacuation route. Maria's movement with the 3 soldiers across the open ground was the most complex evacuation she had attempted, requiring her to coordinate medical care with tactical movement. Maria's successful movement to the ambulance was accomplished through careful coordination and the element of surprise, as the Taliban forces were focused on the American counterattack rather than the evacuation operations. The ambulance was equipped with advanced medical equipment that allowed Maria to provide more comprehensive care than had been possible in the field. She immediately began reassessing the soldiers' conditions and providing treatments that required proper medical equipment and a stable environment. The medical equipment in the ambulance included intravenous fluid systems, oxygen delivery equipment, and monitoring devices that allowed Maria to assess the soldiers' conditions more accurately. Mitchell's blood pressure was critically low, indicating severe internal bleeding that would require immediate surgical intervention. Chun's oxygen saturation was marginal, suggesting that his lung injury was more severe than initially assessed. Thompson's neurological signs were deteriorating, with his pupils becoming more dilated and less responsive, indicating that his brain injury was progressing rapidly. Maria's treatment of the 3 soldiers in the ambulance utilized her full medical training and experience, as she finally had access to proper equipment and a controlled environment. She started multiple intravenous lines to address blood loss and dehydration, administered oxygen to improve respiratory function, and provided medications that could help stabilize their conditions until they reached the base medical facility. However, the most critical treatments required surgical intervention that could only be provided at a properly equipped medical facility. The route to the base medical facility was complicated by the ongoing battle and the tactical situation around the base. Several roads were blocked by damaged vehicles and debris from the mortar bombardment, requiring Maria to navigate alternative routes that were less direct but potentially safer. The ambulance's movement would also attract enemy attention, as Taliban forces would recognize that medical evacuation was occurring and would attempt to prevent it. Maria's driving required her to balance speed with safety, moving quickly enough to provide timely medical care, but carefully enough to avoid enemy fire. Maria's navigation of the ambulance through the base was complicated by her need to simultaneously drive the vehicle and provide medical care to the 3 soldiers. The tactical situation required her to vary her route and speed to avoid predictable patterns that enemy observers could target. The ambulance's medical equipment allowed her to monitor the soldiers' conditions during transport, but she could see that all 3 were deteriorating and needed immediate surgical intervention that exceeded what she could provide in the field. Approach to the base medical facility was marked by increased enemy fire as Taliban forces recognized that medical evacuation was occurring. Mortar rounds began impacting the area around the medical facility, indicating that the enemy was attempting to prevent casualty treatment and disrupt the base's medical operations. Maria's final approach to the facility required her to drive through a barrage of enemy fire while maintaining medical care and ensuring that the soldiers' conditions did not deteriorate further during the most dangerous phase of the evacuation. Maria's arrival at the base medical facility was met by a full medical team that had been prepared for mass casualties by the base's medical officer. The facility was equipped with surgical capabilities and staffed with medical personnel who could provide the specialized care that the three soldiers required. Maria's handover of medical information to the facility's medical staff was comprehensive, including detailed descriptions of the soldiers' injuries, the treatment she had provided, and the medical assessments she had conducted during the rescue and evacuation operations. The medical team's assessment of the three soldiers confirmed Maria's diagnoses and treatment decisions, validating her medical judgment and the care she had provided under extremely difficult circumstances. Mitchell was immediately taken to surgery to repair his internal injuries and stabilize his condition. Chun was transferred to the intensive care unit for monitoring and additional treatment of his respiratory injuries. Thompson was rushed to emergency surgery to address his brain injury, though his prognosis remained uncertain due to the severity of his trauma. Maria's debriefing with the base medical officer revealed the full scope of her rescue operation and the medical challenges she had overcome. The physician, Colonel David Harrison, was amazed by the complexity of the medical care Maria had provided and the tactical risks she had accepted to save the three soldiers. Colonel Harrison's assessment was that the soldiers would not have survived without Maria's immediate intervention and her willingness to attempt a rescue that others had considered impossible. The tactical situation at FOB Sentinel was resolved later that morning when air support arrived and neutralized the Taliban positions that had been maintaining fire on the base. The enemy attack had been repelled, but the cost had been significant, with multiple casualties and extensive damage to the base's facilities. Maria's rescue operation had been the only successful casualty evacuation conducted during the attack, demonstrating the importance of individual initiative and medical expertise in combat situations. Maria's actions during the Taliban attack became the subject of official recognition and investigation by military authorities. The soldiers she had rescued all survived their injuries, though their recovery required extensive medical treatment and rehabilitation. Mitchell returned to duty after 6 months of recovery. Chun was medically retired due to respiratory complications, and Thompson required additional surgery but eventually made a full recovery. Their survival was directly attributed to Maria's medical expertise and her willingness to attempt a rescue that military doctrine considered tactically impossible. The aftermath of the rescue operation resulted in significant changes to Maria's military career and recognition of her combat medical capabilities. She was awarded the Silver Star for her actions during the attack, becoming one of the few medics to receive such recognition for medical heroism under fire. More importantly, the Army's assessment of her physical capabilities was revised, and she was reassigned to combat medical units where her skills and experience could be fully utilized. Maria's story became a testament to the importance of individual initiative and medical expertise in combat situations. Her ability to provide complex medical care under extreme tactical circumstances demonstrated that combat effectiveness was not solely determined by physical strength, but by the combination of training, experience, and determination. The soldiers she saved became advocates for her abilities and helped change military attitudes about the role of medical personnel in combat operations. The investigation into Maria's background revealed her extensive civilian medical experience and raised questions about the military's utilization of personnel with specialized skills. Her success in saving 3 soldiers under impossible circumstances led to changes in military medical training and recognition that combat medical care required practitioners with advanced training and experience. Maria's case became a model for integrating civilian medical expertise into military operations, Colonel Harrison's official report on Maria's actions concluded that her rescue operation had been successful due to her unique combination of medical training, combat experience, and tactical awareness. The report recommended that military medical personnel with similar civilian backgrounds be identified and utilized more effectively in combat operations. Maria's story became part of military medical training, illustrating the importance of individual initiative and advanced medical skills in saving lives under combat conditions. Maria Rodriguez had proven that being considered too weak for combat was a judgment that failed to recognize the true nature of combat effectiveness. Her rescue of 3 soldiers under impossible circumstances demonstrated that the most important combat capability was not physical strength, but the combination of skill, determination, and willingness to risk everything to save others. The soldiers who had once questioned her abilities now owed their lives to the medic they had underestimated. What would you do if everyone told you that you weren't strong enough, but lives depended on your actions? Maria's story shows us that true strength isn't measured in physical power, but in the courage to act when others believe the situation is hopeless. Her medical expertise, gained through years of civilian combat experience, proved that sometimes the most overlooked person in the room is exactly who you need in a crisis. Have you ever been underestimated because of your size, gender, or background? Share your story in the comments below. We all have moments when we prove the doubters wrong. And if Maria's incredible rescue operation inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you more amazing stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. Because sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the one who saves the day.